Welcome everyone. We're at 10:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have more people trickling in as the time goes along, but just wanted to welcome you to our Engaged Learning Forum today. The Engaged Learning Forum is a series of events hosted by the Center for Social Concerns, where we are privileged and excited to talk about community engaged pedagogy and research. We're very pleased today to welcome Professor Macaluso. I never know kind of when to stop. You know, a set of kids that have Professor Macaluso, we can just keep going. But we're very excited for them to join us today, talk about their project, Social Justice Book Club for Teachers. I never remember where to put the teachers word. We're very excited to have this conversation. These are meant to be very informal, interactive sessions, so please do join in the conversation. I know they're very excited to talk about this project and then the implications of it moving forward. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to them and we'll wrap things up around 11:45.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We appreciate being here. We appreciate you being here. So thanks for spending some time with us today. Yeah, I'm Mike Macaluso.
Kati Macaluso. We're not brother sister. We're married.
And then we work primarily in the IEI. We are professors in the ACE program. We also teach in the IEI's Education, Schooling, and Society program, and we're faculty members in the Center for Literacy Education as well. So I feel like everything we talk about today is going to kind of touches on all those domains of what we do, right?
Absolutely.
So to start, do you want to introduce the poem here?
Yeah, so to get us started, we just thought we'd turn your brains on a little bit and share a poem out with all of you. We don't actually engage with poetry with the teachers in this particular book club, but this was an activity we did with them just to kick off our time together in this book club. So we just want to invite you to read this poem and think about, if you were a teacher who had the opportunity to bring this poem into your classroom, what would you latch on to in your planning and instruction of this poem?
So I think we can sort of gather together. So for our friends who maybe are watching, this is a poem by Clint Smith titled "For the Taxi Cabs That Pass Me in Harvard Square," just in case it doesn't come through. Are any of you familiar with Clint Smith? He's a really phenomenal writer. He writes for The Atlantic. He just received his PhD. And he just came out with a book very recently called How the Word Was Passed. It's sort of about the myth of slavery in America. And it's really phenomenal, really well done. It was part of his graduate work. I use a chapter of it in another class that I teach, but he sort of visits different sites around the United States to think about, what are some myths that persist around slavery. So he's a really good writer, but we thought we'd share a couple of comments that we overheard. So, on the one sense, like this is a very literal poem of, the cabs that continue to pass him as he's standing in Harvard Square. The idea that, here he is as a Black man, he's in Harvard Square, he has his Ivy League ID, and sort of I think I heard like the sort of public racism of just sort of continually being passed by, right? And that's on a very literal level, but there's also some of these like, metaphorical aspects. Like he says in that second to last stanza, right? Imagine yourself as a puddle existing as both transparency and filth, something that won't be there by the afternoon. So even just sort of that metaphorical detail of seeing himself as a puddle in the square because he continues to be passed by.
Yeah, so like reading across the two groups worth of comments between what Mike was listening into and what I was listening into, there were a few kind of domains that surfaced. In some ways, this was an opportunity to name this experience of duality and thick racial bias that this highly educated Black man in Harvard Square is experiencing. Also, there was reference made across both groups, I heard, to just the use of metaphor in this poem and the way that the craft of the text itself really opened up our eyes and allowed us to see the speaker for who he really is and what he experiences. At the same time, too, I heard across both groups just sort of this naming of some of your own experiences and the ways in which this particular speaker's narrative connects with some of the contemporary narratives of our time. that either you have experienced personally or encountered others who have experienced personally as well. And all of those things, both from the surfacing of these, very problematic issues of justice and injustice in our world, the ability to access our own experience and other people's experiences, and also to do that through the craft of the text itself, and become better readers of text, both literal and figurative in the world, are some of the things that we really wanted to work with teachers on through this book club that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to move forward, Mike. Actually, we'll skip that. Yeah, so just to kind of lay the foundation, a lot of what you guys shared that you took away from this particular short poem is consistent with one of the most recent surveys done by Scholastic of teachers and principals, where they were asked what they perceived to be the top benefits of engaging with both fiction and nonfiction texts in a K-12 setting. And you'll see some of the things they listed there. Across the board, essentially, many teachers and leaders were talking about the ability of literature or reading in general to help students foster empathy. We, in our proposal, leaned quite heavily for this grant that made this opportunity possible on the work of Don Zancanella, who talks about the capacity for reading to knit people together across lines of difference. And that was definitely something that we went into this project hoping to do. And they're also talking here too in this survey about the ability of literature to expose students to sometimes seemingly otherwise invisible issues that they might not face in their own lives based upon their own identity. And then the ability of literature, both nonfiction and fiction, I should say, to raise important issues and questions. And so if we believe that literature and reading can do these things, then Mike and I are operating from the standpoint of reading as this vehicle for social justice. And social justice is a term that we feel gets thrown around a lot. Sometimes I don't think we stop to think about what we really mean by social justice. So we wanted to take a moment today to just define how we're taking up social justice in the context of this book club with our teachers. And we're really treating it as this form of moral rectitude at the institutional, and that might mean social, political, economic, and also existential level. And this last part is really important. In short, we see social justice as a commitment to standing in the margins, to bring about greater equality of opportunity and to uphold the dignity of all. And that's really consistent even, with one of Pope Francis's most recent encyclicals, Fratelli Tutti, on this idea of fraternity and social friendship. He talks a lot about the importance of encounter, right? And walking across lines of difference. And we feel like if reading can be a form of figurative migration, it's a vehicle by which that kind of encounter and that ability to stand in the margins can happen.
I think that's also really well illustrated just in this simple poem alone, right? I mean, all those aspects about encounter, about sort of standing in the margin to understand how someone's dignity is not being upheld, right? I think that this poem does a really good job of sort of bringing to light those issues. So just to kind of give us a sense of how we engaged in this project then. So Katie and I teach English language arts teachers at the middle school and high school level. So obviously, we take seriously the role that the English language arts curriculum can play in promoting respect and dignity for all people. As Katie said, we also believe that English language arts instruction is important in knitting together across difference, perspectives, peoples, cultures, language. However, we're also very much aware that English language arts education has not always taken up that goal. So to illustrate this, to sort of see where we see some tension here, we're going to have you do another little short activity. So we'd love for you to just come up with a list with some people around you of the most commonly assigned and taught texts in the state of Indiana in grades 6 through 12 today. All right, so just sort of off the top of your heads, what do you think are some common books that are being assigned and taught in our classrooms today? I'll explain sort of the survey project that we did here in a second, but you just take a minute to write yourself or chat with someone around you. We'd love to see sort of some of the ideas that you come up with. Like 2 or 3 minutes. All right, so can we hear a couple comments? We love this. So we should say that we do this with our English teachers a lot, and it's obviously really fun to do this with English teachers because, right, this is sort of what they do. But I actually think it's more fun to do this with folks who, are not necessarily English teachers because the results end up being the same regardless. So it's kind of fun to see what everyone comes up with. So can I just hear an author? I didn't say that. We could have approached this from an author too, if there's an author that stands out, or a text.
All my kids went to school in Indiana, and I'm pretty sure they all read Killmonger.
Okay, classic. Shakespeare, right? There's some places that believe Shakespeare needs to be taught at every level still. Good. Other ideas? Julius Caesar is a popular one. Lord of the Flies, classic, right? It's one of those ones that's short. It's got sort of an easy reading level, but it's deep. So we kind of see that in a number of grade levels.
I heard Huck Finn over here.
Yeah, middle school white fang. I was surprised to still see that still being taught, because I remember I learned
Yep.
that here, I was educated primarily in Michigan, so just to see that in Indiana, I'm like, wow, they still read that, huh? Yeah.
I heard which one, Catcher in the Rye. Yep, still, the ducks are still in Central Park. They haven't flown away. They're still there, right? Still got the red hat. Though nobody knows what it means, but. And then I heard of Mice and Men in the back, right? So, okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to show you. So we have first on this slide the 9th through 12th. And we do have them ranked in order. So just to give a little background here. So in 2020, Katie and I, we had some undergrads who helped us. We went on the Department of Indiana Education website, got a listing of all of the public and private schools in the state of Indiana. We went on their websites, found the emails for teachers from 5th through 12th grade, collected all those emails and sent out a survey to 1,200 teachers in the state of Indiana. We got 700 responses back. So we were really excited by that. There's a national study that I'll reference in a little bit that was working with 400 responses. So I thought, hey, Indiana, way to show up, right? And part of this was just because it's what we're interested in. We live in Indiana. We're committed to the local community, but this was also coming off the heels of the murder of George Floyd, and there had just been a lot of national discourse about, hey, what are we teaching in our schools? How are we approaching this topic? And we thought, maybe we'll see some change. Maybe someone in a comment, something will come up about something that's changing. I think, as you could probably guess, that wasn't the case. So here's a list of the way we asked was major full-length text, novel, plays, nonfiction texts that comprise your curriculum. Gatsby, right? Of course, Gatsby. Scarlet Letter's still on there, right? Have you read any of these, bud?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any favorites on the list? Any that you're still confused about years later?
I like the Animal Farm, actually. A lot of people have asked it.
All right, nice.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
So we'd love to hear any observations you have from looking at the list. Just any observation at all that you notice. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I raised my hand.
That's okay.
I am an outsider here, but I mean, that could have been my list in the in my school, which wasn't even in this state of Indiana. So it doesn't seem like, it seems like in 1950, they said, you're supposed to learn to read and forget everything that's going on outside, just keep this list.
Good, right? So it hasn't changed much, right?
Probably predominantly dead, old white men.
Okay, good, right? Predominantly white male authors and, predominantly, right, white male protagonists for most of them. Go ahead.
I don't really English class was tough for me in high school, and I didn't like most of these books. But I not that there's like this balance between, is it a classic because it's great, or is it a classic because we've just been doing it and we can't think of something else to do? And so I would happily knock a lot of these off the list, but I'm sure there's some merit to them. I don't know how to approach that.
That's a question that I feel like our field takes up a lot. Like, what is literary merit? Is this because it's tradition and this is what English teachers are supposed to do, or this is what happens in an English class?
That's a great point though, too, about as teachers and school leaders, we have to be thinking about a design rationale. Like, why are we teaching what we're teaching? What are the desired outcomes? Who do we want our students to be as citizens of the world? And you're right. I mean, we don't in any way mean to like discount everything on this list right here. But that question of why are we teaching it? And is there something else that we could be teaching in its place, given what we wanted to accomplish, is really important.
I was just gonna say, of course, the Kite Runner is not old. We wouldn't have been reading it in the 80s or 70s. And I think, I mean, in Indiana, it is good to see those kinds of books in 12th grade. You know, I mean, in 11th and 12th grade, you want to be, those are the kids who are going to go to college, right? So you really want to be pushing them into contemporary issues. And so it's good to see the Kite Runner. Frankenstein, and even all the way up to Kill a Mockingbird, you know, were not written by white men and really should be talked about in the context of the author. And also, I think that, especially in the state of Indiana, I mean, this is a safe list, but a good list. And I think it's important for teachers to keep it, right? Because there's a lot that can be done with these books. And, you know, who would think of throwing Huck Finn off this list? But there's so much that can be done with Huck Finn. So I do think that, you know, generally public schools have been playing it safe, but in a smart way. This is a smart list. I mean, if this is, you know, what's being taught, there's a lot that can be done.
Again, to that point of what are you doing with it, right?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm thinking, for example, Raising the Sun, we got one African-American writer, woman writer, Lorraine Hansberry, playwright writer. And I would counteract like Huck Finn with The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, you know, which scares the establishment, but it's a counteractive to Huck Finn's narrative. Again, looking at time. And so we look at, since George Floyd to present, we become aware of writers who are writing fiction that's based on experience, you know, and that, but Angie Thomas is getting a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
Falling under this whole idea.
Even locally, very locally.
Yeah,
too,
locally and nationally, getting a lot of pushback of the narrative because the primary, the privilege is uncomfortable with the reality of that. And so, you know, as a librarian, and I'm working with teachers here locally in private schools, unfortunately, only private schools, because they seem open to the idea of what are some of the titles in these age ranges that we should consider. But I said, well, you know, you're gonna get pushback from your institution because of these titles. So, you know, that's what I'm thinking. Huck Finn, I would counteract that with Angie Thomas, The Hate You Give, with that, because different time period, but it's
And you're raising a really important point too about not only why are we including the text we're including, what are we doing with them, but how are we using the text in conversation with one another? There's also like a subtext there that we can bring out and should be bringing out in our teaching.
I just say real quick before we get more. I just want to say too, you know, another one that's like more recently has become a little more, I don't know, part of the public discourse is To Kill a Mockingbird. So this is like a sacred book in the United States, right? Everybody loves it, but like it is a book about racism written by a white woman. And so is there room to put in Angie Thomas instead of the
well,
Hate You Give?
no, actually, again, my argument is that, you know, still use tradition, but counteract with
I
what's
see what you're
presently
saying.
available.
Yeah.
Like, here's the thing, it's almost teaching, like introducing high school students to rhetoric before they get to the college level, if they so choose. So that's where I'm thinking at. But see, that's why I always chose higher education. I'm related to a lot of K through 12 teachers, especially middle school and high school, and we have this argument all the time. It's like, I can't do that, and I said, well,
No.
just
We'll talk, if we have time, we'll talk about that even with the teachers we're working with. This has been an issue that's risen to the surface, and we, you know, had to think about how to move forward with that. So in terms of like, well, can we use this in our classroom space? Jody?
There's so many comments. I'm thinking of Leslie's comment that Vivian Vasquez has great books and great work where she's talking about 3 and 4-year-olds being critical readers and not critical ones. The text is just a text, it's words on the page. So I love your point of just teach kids at an early age to read through, like to read it critically and through a multicultural critical lens, we just keep layering it. So I actually don't see anything wrong with this text. I think I would hate for teachers to get the message that you have to throw everything out because there's a lot of value that is not just one of the great stories I've ever written. I would hate to throw some of this out for that sake. So just it's just words. It's what we do.
Just a quick observation, there's not a lot of nonfiction. It's an unprompted word, correct, but it's not.
It's not there, yeah, it's not there. And that's another thing that so the book club that we're doing with our teachers, one of the goals is to really get them to put literature in conversation with contemporary issues. And so we've tried to show them models of, here are some nonfiction informational texts that we would put in conversation with this work of literary fiction, because it's bringing students, it's exposing them to the conventions of multiple genres then, and allowing them to do what we really want them to do at the end of the day, which is to be able to dialogue with the world around them. So that's a great point, the nonfiction. I think teachers are scared of it to some extent. We're storied people, so we kind of gravitate towards the fiction, but having both is important.
Thinking about the comment about maybe facing pushback from teachers or other groups, and obviously that would look one way in a public system, but thinking within Catholic education, I think the language of preferential option is really gives a tool to say we don't need justification for preferring the voices that have historically been marginalized, because that's ingrained in the gospel message. And so, I think I came from a conservative Catholic school background. I can imagine there would have been a lot of pushback there. But for those who, if this is important to us, we have the language to, I think, to support our cause of why we should have this broader.
I think you'll probably get to this, but I'm curious in this space about conversation around prioritizing classics. What does it mean when teachers have to hit metrics, and if you are wanting to have more radically inclusive literature, but you are forced to decide, what does that mean for the points that you're reading for your standards? And so I think if a student or a teacher wants to meet more queer inclusive literature, more literature with female heroes, more literature that has racial diversity, but they're pressed against different metrics, what does that mean? And what does that look like?
So just as a kind of surface level response to that comment and question, I think it's a really good one. It is interesting. Typically, the standards obviously don't dictate the body of text that we teach in the language arts domain, at least. We're different from a content area like social studies in that regard, because they're more about the content itself, whereas from a language and literacy standpoint, it's more about the skills and strategies and concepts that students take away from reading as both readers and writers. So that's a great point about because we face that question from our teachers a lot about, well, we have to meet these metrics and standards. So what we oftentimes really try to get them to think about is this relationship between and among the text that you're teaching, the essential question that it inspires. And another way of thinking about that is what are the issues that it brings to the table? Neither of which are really tied to the metrics that we're held accountable to as teachers. As teachers, we're held more accountable to, as I said earlier, the skills, the strategies, and the concepts. So thinking about, okay, what texts are available to me that will get me to the questions and issues that I really do want to take up with my students, but also bring a set of skills and strategies and concepts to the table that my students have to demonstrate mastery of. So, you know, we in one of the most recent book club meetings that we had, we were working with a middle grade text, When Stars Are Scattered, which is about, you know, these two children refugees fleeing the genocide in Rwanda. They end up at a refugee camp in Kenya. And there was, I mean, talk about in terms of like the things that you can do with reliance on textual evidence, and thinking about what in the course of those children's narrative triggers transformation, to think about how a character evolves from beginning of text to end in relation to conflict, and how it is that theme is born out of that. There was so much that we could do with that, and that really came up in the conversation. And so we were taking up a really important set of questions about childhood trauma, about refugeeism, about actually gender roles came up a lot in that text as well. The text itself lent itself to that. It was a graphic novel as well. But then the skills and concepts that we were able to talk about as a group of teachers that we could work with students to hone were very much in line with the standards. I do think that one of the things, Mike and I talk about this a little bit, because he's really much more of a guru than me when it comes to knowing just the canon of diverse middle grade and YA books that are out there for the middle and secondary levels. It can be difficult sometimes, we think, or at least I think, to land upon like just texts that are really rich in craft and allow you to do that kind of sophisticated analysis that we want our students to be able to do in and through text. And so that was something that we really did think carefully about with the texts that we selected with these teachers, because we wanted to make sure that if they were to use these texts, that they could still meet those standards.
So I think we're gonna touch on some of these things as we move on, but I think maybe to just kind of continue and for the sake of time, just point out a couple things here. So one thing that, you know, that also didn't come up is if we think about grades 6 through 12, and let's say like students read an average of 4 books a year. So we're thinking about like 28 books, right? Students get somewhere around 28 books that they read and discuss with their peers. And one thing that sort of stood out to us too was like, we're also seeing, not necessarily that students are reading repeated text, but it's sort of like we're drawing from the same set of text at each grade level too. And so that was something that we just sort of saw as, that was apparent in both the high school list and the middle school list, which I'll get to in a second. And also just as a side note, the list is not that different from the national list. So these three lists are the 3 most recent national studies that have been done. And as you can see, right, again, what's happening in Indiana is not that different than what's happening on a national level. So in looking at the middle grade list, I'll give you a second just to kind of look at that. I think what's exciting about this is there's never been a study of what's being taught at the middle school level, probably because it is just so diverse and there's just so much out there. But it was good to get, I think, a snapshot of what's happening, at least in the state of Indiana, and to think about you know, what we're seeing there. I think to my other point, like we are seeing a lot of kind of repeats or things that are coming up, or you know, within the same grade level. Does anyone have a quick comment about this list before I move on? Anything that sort of jumps out at you?
I see a lot of new theories, but
Yeah.
more contemporary and slightly more diverse authors, perhaps.
Slightly, yeah.
You know, Watson's Birmingham jumps out. That's happening.
Something that we're seeing, I think, across, even with our English teachers across the nation, we're seeing more and more like Holocaust units about the, you know, teachers taking up the Holocaust. not really sure, why or whatnot. Perhaps it's this idea of like, collective memory or not wanting to forget or whatnot, but it does seem something that there tends to be a lot of middle school books about the Holocaust and something that's being taken up in classrooms. So that's where I think we're seeing, right, some of that in the 8th grade level. Yeah, Judy.
I'm still confused, like why Alice is Adventure in Wonderland. I teach a children's lit class and we're actually reading lots of these. We just finished one time. We read Alice about the semester, and it's such a bizarre.
It's so bizarre, right?
Fantasy, yeah, like written from the viewpoint of a crazy 8-year-old. So I'm like wondering how you go from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to Kill a Mockingbird, rape and racism. That's a huge jump. Maybe that's just not. But it seems a little all over the place. The whole thing picture upper elementary or something like that. That's a jump. Just sounds like 3 months. One grade.
Yeah. Kathy, were you?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm just having this parental moment where I'm thinking, those are books that I read at that time, and when did I encounter those, and how am I then as a parent equipped to have a conversation that supports challenges, my children, like some of those same types. So there's some value in having, intergenerational familiarity, but I'm also longing for really reading those things, can we read more? Can we read those in class? And need more us and then to your point that they're reading so much of these pages of it. I'm kind of surprised
There's lots of conversations about Sherman Alexie, right? I mean, he was implicated in the Me Too, right? I mean, Absolutely True Diary, I think, just opened the door to young adult literature in a way that maybe other books hadn't before. So I think that book got a lot of kids reading and sort of kicked off this like current craze that we're seeing in adult lit. But there's issues with that book too. So I don't know. He is sort of an interesting guy, but I don't want to discount the the work that book has done to just kind of help us think a little more broadly about the young adult lit market, I think. So I think in sort of coming off of Connie's point and then like hearing everything you're saying, I think we're sort of approaching this from like, is this an obstacle to social justice when we think about these lists? So again, to reiterate some of the things that have been said, we don't want to like throw out or discount the books that are on that list, but we are wondering if we look at them as a whole, right? Like if that's what students are getting in their middle school and high school experience, right? As a whole, they're seeing, right, for the most part, monocultural perspective, right? We talked about sort of the white author, white character, predominantly male perspective there through these books. And as you all are pointing out, like we're wondering about sort of even if we take into account the universality of literature, are we looking at some dated worlds? Are they not maybe as relevant now? Certainly something like the Holocaust we want our students to learn about. So I think that's different.
Or even because they're dated, are we giving students the license to say, oh, that was then, now it's different. So back to that point of, yes, like we use Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun for right now, every other year with our ACE teachers. That's our focal text, and it's a canonical text. But one of the things we try to do is show how like the redlining that happens in that play, that's part of the conflict, like it's still happening today.
So yeah, just to add on to that, I love the list, but there's enough writers for elementary, middle school, and high school to counteract or to complement those texts that are listed for 6 to 12. That's my art. That how do we look at past? How do we look at current and present? And as we discovered and learned after George Floyd's death, is that these young people today in schools, their friends cross racial and socioeconomic lines. So, and not, each generation goes through that protest period and all of that. And so, I don't know, I just, as an education librarian here, when I'm talking to teachers, whether in public or Catholic schools, there's always like, well, I don't know what I should do. And I said, well, may I just give you some things to think about in terms of that, but realizing the reality of administrative limitations. So,
I think another obstacle that I'm thinking about as well is this unit on the Holocaust alone. I think this is kind of this like polarization around like histories that are prioritized, and so there's no reflection around like the local traumas that have been in the US. So like Native and Indigenous communities and the erasure there, or like any other the history of slavery, or like why are there not equal, or not equal, but just attention to units and prioritization. So it's always going to be Holocaust as a prioritization, that's great, but where is the gravity around other units?
It's interesting, I've read that curriculum. It's less. Everybody read it when I was that age. It's like my mind is in working with these teachers, but also in Japanese laws that are being proposed in Indiana as well as other states, some states, other states, liberty, and putting oversight of the teachers around anything to history, to challenging the ways that we taught things in the past. So that's one piece, and the other piece is that the still overwhelmingly teachers are from it. And so how, with those kinds of two contextual realities, how do we help move the needle?
I also think I just saw a report. It's from this group called Renaissance. They're like a reading company, and I mean that's surprising. One of their findings this year was that as students age, they read fewer books, right? So they're more likely to read more books in the middle grade level, probably because their school has like a book of the month or independent book clubs or something like that. And in high school, it's more likely that they're going to get these few texts. So in sort of thinking about all of this, then, I mean, that's kind of how we approach this project. Why does this matter? Should we do anything about it? And what can or should we do about it? So I just wanted to point out two quick things. First of all, this came from a PBS study that was just recently published, just looking at US data and thinking about the population of the United States. On the first day of 2020, whites under the age of 18 were already in the minority. Among all the young people in the United States, there are more minority young people than there are white young people. And so by 2030, whites as a proportion of the population will get smaller, minority race groups will keep getting bigger. So we're just sort of thinking about that in the context of those lists that you saw, and think about, it's not a reflection of the real world, it's lopsided. The population is changing. We're also thinking about everything that's been brought up with just sort of what's happening in the world today, right? Teachers more and more, as this one article shows, they want to talk about Black Lives Matter, about racism, but sometimes they're just not sure how to do that or how to go about doing that, or the books that they're using don't necessarily easily lend themselves to those conversations. Even something like, climate change, or when we think about sort of environmental justice, this summer, there was so much news about what was happening on the West Coast where, water was running out in Oregon and in California. And so what are some of the ways in which we could think about that? I just included a little snapshot here. The National Council of Teachers of English even made a resolution on sort of how do we incorporate the literacy of climate change in what we're doing. So there is an awareness that there's pressing issues, but the question is how, and even if those issues are being brought up in classrooms.
So basically by now, what's very clear is that, if we have this commitment to students being lifelong thoughtful readers and really fully flourishing human beings that are doers of justice, and we're at the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic University, and really what we're about is building the kingdom of God, right? then we want our students to be making contemporary connections between the word and world, which Mike has already shown is certainly possible in the last slide. We want them to be reading varied texts that expose them to a number of different narratives and stories and perspectives that are out there, both similar and different from their own. And then we want them to read, develop empathy and perspective taking skills, all while meeting those academic achievement markers that were brought up that we are still accountable to. Now, the good news is that, you know, there are the texts available. There's the material available to do this. So on the current literary scene or in the current literary landscape, there's just been this proliferation of middle grade and young adult texts in particular that are pretty rich, really kind of pushing back on my comment from earlier that for a long time, it did seem like a bit of a struggle to find those texts that surface the issues and questions that we value, while also really helping to hone those, you know, analysis and synthesis oriented skills that we need our students to demonstrate mastery of. There's just a whole host of texts out there that bring issues of environmental justice to the table, immigration, refugeeism, classism, gender equality issues, you know,
gun violence.
gun violence, yep, poverty, homelessness. I mean, the list goes on and on. And in this recent article from the International Literacy Association, from Literacy Today, you know, they made this argument that we really, you know, the texts are out there, but we need the teachers to have the courage and the confidence to be able to take up texts and really kind of push the envelope a bit. And so now there are a couple of barriers to that. The next slide really shows that there are, you know, 90% of educators agree that access to these texts, even though they're out there, can be a challenge, right? Both from a funding standpoint, a convincing of parents, stakeholders, and administrators standpoint. So the access piece is an issue, but also too is the confidence and courage piece. So in a recent Scholastic report, you know, 79% of educators, you know, this right-hand side is really still more about access, but on the left, like teachers, they're hungry for professional development that is going to support them in incorporating, you know, anti-racism practices into the classroom, embedding social justice, really navigating challenging conversations, essentially, right?
I just love that 71%, right, responded that they need to know how to embed social justice issues into the classroom, right? So I mean, that just spoke so loudly to us when we thought about this larger project and whatnot.
Yeah, so knowing the possibilities out there and the impediments to really bringing those possibilities to fruition and to actualizing them. You know, Mike and I, at the start of this project, when the CSC made this, put this grant proposal out there, we thought, you know, what can we do about this? Because we were just coming off the heels of the survey that we referenced earlier, which was an opportunity to really become aware of what the curricular landscape looked like, to analyze why we thought it looked that way. And then, you know, we really wanted to do something actionable. And so we felt, you can skip 2 slides there, Mike. I won't get too far. Sorry, one back. Yeah. So we thought, okay, if we want to diversify the language arts curriculum through the formation of teachers, which we believe is important, the teacher piece, because they really are agents of change in our culture, then maybe something like a teacher book club that discusses books that tackle social justice issues might be, you know, it's a seemingly simple thing, but it might be something that moves the needle a bit. And so we took up those problems that I've identified earlier and thought about how could we use this opportunity for funding and our time and interests to respond to some of those impediments. So if access to texts is one of the impediments, then we could use the funding available to us if we are granted this funding to help teachers receive free copies of some high quality texts that bring these kinds of issues and questions to the table. And, you know, if they participate fully in the opportunity that we present to them, give them a free classroom set of books of their choosing that meet the criteria that we set out. We also felt like this community of practice among peers across the area really helps to give them courage. There's power in numbers and in sharing of ideas. And then it also gives them confidence. So we not only come together to talk about the books and the content of the books, But also, these teachers are collaborating with each other across school lines to generate some curricular kind of unit planning materials and lesson planning materials so that they have the support needed to like operationalize these texts in a classroom space next year. So it'll be really interesting to follow them into next year and see what they do with this. But just as one example of the courage and confidence piece earlier, this issue of just this problem that teachers face of like, well, I see a lot of value in this text, but I feel like I'm going to get a lot of pushback. Kind of informally, the teachers in our book club, and there's 15 of them across 7 schools, they are coming together in a more informal capacity now to try to build a list beyond the short list of titles in our book club of texts that they feel would be appropriate in their school setting and some sort of rationale for why, so that they have that rationale and language at their disposal. It's really interesting. We extended the invitation for this book club to public and private schools in the area. And I think it might be because just of our own networks and the branding of ACE, like the people who responded, 100% of our folks, aside from one teacher who's more in a tutor ND context, they're all from Catholic schools. But we were thinking about why that's the case. A lot of our Catholic school teachers are siloed and they're on islands. In a Catholic school, which is typically in the elementary K-8 setting, you're gonna have one teacher teaching all of the middle school students. So it's 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And that teacher has no one else in that school building to dialogue with. This is, there's not a department where they can hash out ideas. In the high school, you have more of that, but particularly in our K-8 settings, this community of practice we think is really important because it's helping to build communities of teachers across those school lines, and they don't feel like they're on an island anymore. So I just wanted to raise that as like one interesting data point and potential outcome of this project.
So the hard part then was picking the books, and I think we got a lot of guidance from the community impact grant that this came from, and sort of helping us think about what are some good books that we could do in this book club. And in our grant, we had proposed these texts. So Front Desk by Kelly Yang, which deals with just wage and immigration. Darius the Great is Not Okay, mental health. Dry, environmental justice. The Hate You Give, racial justice. And When Stars Are Scattered, which we mentioned earlier, dealing with immigration, refugees, and adverse childhood experiences. So we put these in there, and the ones that have the darker shading on the background are the ones that we're doing in our book club. So we just finished When Stars Are Scattered. Just most recently we did Dry, and then we're doing Front Desk later this month. Just a couple of, I guess, real quick comments on this. So Front Desk is one of those books that's been put on this like anti-critical race theory list, which is just remarkable to me because this is just a wonderful book that tackles immigration and racism in a very simple way. It's a middle grade text. So it's just like, I don't understand how this is on any sort of anti-list because it's just so well done. Dry, we had some teachers who were really excited about this book as like a sort of modern dystopia, but also real life and being able to talk about, how do we think about resources? How do we think about sustainability? And how do we think about this that's going on in the world today? And then When Stars Are Scattered, so it's sort of fun and somewhat happenstance. It also was the winner of the Center for Literacy Education's inaugural Alexandria Award. So that was sort of a fun way to also have that book in there. And it's a graphic novel. And so for many of our teachers, it was their first graphic novel that they had ever read, which was sort of interesting. And so many of them loved it that they've already started adopting it in their classroom. So we're just so excited to see, to see that as something that is already just sort of impacting an immediate change here. Oh, sure, go ahead.
I'm gonna go back as a way of landing this. So actually the slide with the so
This one?
yeah. I just wanted to point this out, just sort of as a conceptual framework for thinking about our project. That has really, I don't know that we had the language to conceptualize it this way when at the outset of the project, but because of some work that's happening in the IEI and with ACE in particular, in and around what we're calling a Christocentric cultural responsiveness framework as we work with Catholic school teachers and leaders, which I think is relevant just like in the context of our work as educators at Notre Dame and the larger like South Bend community. We, as part of that Christocentric cultural responsiveness framework, we've been talking a lot lately about what it means to promote human flourishing. And I mentioned earlier that as teachers charged with making our students better readers and writers, we're also charged with making them fully flourishing human beings. And we've been talking recently about this framework of liberatory consciousness. And I think Dr. Barbara Love's quote there is, it's just a nice way of sort of defining liberatory consciousness, which she says enables humans to maintain, I should say an awareness of the dynamics of oppression characterizing society without giving into despair and hopelessness about that condition, and to maintain awareness of the role played by each of an individual in the maintenance of the system without blaming them for the roles they play, and at the same time practice intentionality about changing the systems of oppression. So like embedded in that whole definition of liberatory consciousness is this sort of this 4-step process of awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. And as Mike and I were reflecting on this project thus far, which is still in process, I think that that survey work and our own interest in the curriculum and the work that the ELA curriculum can do, that was an exercise of awareness, becoming aware, and then of course asking the questions to help make sense of why things are the way they are and what could be done differently. And then this community engagement grant really allowed us to take the action of this book club that we feel from an accountability standpoint can impact lasting change, because we do believe that teachers are change agents. So working with teachers in particular was important to us. But what's really beautiful about it, we think, is that the action of this book club and the empowerment of teachers and this building community among teachers in and around text is inspiring their students then to become more aware and more analytical about the world around them. So it's really like liberatory consciousness at its best, which produces more liberatory consciousness. So I just wanted to name that because we really are so grateful for this opportunity, because without the community engagement grant, like I don't think that we would have been able to necessarily take this action that is then like feeding back into the cycle. So
I think to that point, we just have some final thoughts here, but so by the conclusion then, what we hope is that we have impacted the community, giving teachers comfort levels and talking about new books, introducing new titles into the curriculum, enhancing students' critical capacities through teachers' collaborative design unit plans. And then one thing that we didn't mention was all of the books were provided through the Brain Layer bookstore, which is a local bookstore in town. So just like sort of another way to embed the community in the project. We just wanted to share very quickly sort of what we've learned so far. I hesitated to say kind of learn, because I think, as I was saying to David via email a couple days ago, like I think just so much has been affirmed from the research and the project so far. So obviously the curriculum is kind of slow to change, even in light of national discourse. Teachers do want updated curricular materials for their classrooms, but the impediments have always been, what are those materials? How do I get them? And how do we talk about this in our classroom? Even after our last session, one of the teachers was saying she needed help thinking about another book. And so it was sort of like, I don't have the time to read everything. Can you help me like pinpoint a book or two that I could read? So we sort of felt like that was a good role for us to kind of help vet the books and then bring some suggestions forward. Several teachers have already said that they plan to adopt the books that we're discussing in some way. Several are saying that they're going to use the funds to purchase a class set for a whole class novel study. So not just books that are going to end up on their shelves, but they're books they're going to read and study together. And the reception's been really positive. I love this. I love these quotes. It just sort of reaffirmed for us that teachers don't have many opportunities like this one. One teacher signing up wrote us a note that said, I can't believe this is real. Which again, like just the fact that like, here's a class set for you, like that just is so rare. Another teacher emailed me and said, all right, what's the catch? I'm like, there is no catch. Like you come, you talk about books, you get a set of books and they're like, okay, I'm signing up, so just again, proof that like this just doesn't happen for them. And then just like thinking forward, we do hope to sort of scale up the initiative. I think with the Center for Literacy Education, one way that we've seen that with When Stars Are Scattered is to try to get these books at a national level into the hands of teachers and schools. And so we're just sort of thinking about, how can we do that maybe more broadly and think about ways in which that we can just get more books into the hands of teachers, and especially this idea of like class set so that we know the books are working their way into the curriculum. You want to add anything?
The last
All
one.
right.
That's great.
So I think that's it then. Thank you so much for
But,
having us and
yeah.
thanks for
If
working
there's,
with
I
us
think we
today.
have time, if there are any more questions or comments, we do have a little bit more time, at least schedule wise. I know you might not have more time, but I'm happy to take any more, but it's been so nice to be so interactive throughout. So thank you for that.
I just want to thank you. This is so exciting. I can hear you just, again, I'm on memory really here, like remembering how influential these literature classes were for me, right? That's where you get to fiction or nonfiction. That's where there's social issues. And to Lulu's point, if there's only one issue presented or, what gets discussed in those spaces, I think matters quite a bit. And the range of issues you're putting out there is just absolutely key, A history class might march you through some, big events and things, but a literature class moves you if it's done right, and informs you, especially at those young ages, to be a lifelong, activist, a person who cares and whatever profession you go into, I think. So this is so important. And then you found sort of a hunger across these teachers for them. It's hard to do alone, right? This is social stuff, right? So it should be learned and practiced and developed in a social setting. So I love that you designed this whole response in a way that was social in and of itself, not just sending books, right? But we need to talk about these and to model that with them in ways that you're already seeing that going into the classrooms is super exciting for me and appreciate your sort of continuum of how these things work. So just thank you again as a parent and a professional, just to really feeling what you can do. So thanks.
Thank you.
I do have a question. When you were working with the teachers, did Catholic social teaching kind of come in the conversation some kind of way? So I like to say I'm a Catholic social teaching Catholic. And so coming into this environment from that because Catholic social teaching and social justice in my mind, in my experience too. But I'm wondering, did that play a role in the conversations and from the different schools?
In the first, when we had the first meeting with the teachers, there was no text under discussion. It was really more to just lay the groundwork and establish some frameworks that we'd be leaning on. And some of the tenets of Catholic social teaching, we brought explicitly to the table there. Then I would say, really, because we ended up with this community of primarily Catholic educators, they bring it to the table too. So in talking about both dry and When Stars Are Scattered, some of those tenets of Catholic social teaching, and even some of the just kind of nods to some of the encyclicals that are out there have also come up in the conversation, just because that's something that we ended up with a group of people that are pretty well versed in that discourse. And I think, to your point from earlier, they see the language of our faith as a way of really, as something that they can leverage to enact the change that they want to enact.
I think that first session they came wanting, knowing that, and sort of
Yes.
how do we do this? We just need to talk through how we can more fully do this in our classrooms and bring in Catholic social teaching.
Because I'm from Detroit, so
Yes.
I went to a Black Catholic high school and pretty much a diverse middle school Catholic school. So it was embedded. It's almost like breathing air.
Totally. It's like,
And
yeah.
so I was fortunate to have nuns and priests and lay people
Right.
who were just committed to that. So I was reading stuff. So when I started college, my first 2 years of college as an English major was easy breezy because I had already addressed some of those things that I had. So my class went, they said, your teachers at Catholic school had you guys read this? I said, absolutely, because Catholic social teaching plays a role in social justice issues. So
What Catholic schools did you go to in Detroit?
Was closed now.
Yeah, is it?
Both were closed, of course.
Closed,
One
yeah.
was St. Teresa Avila Catholic School for middle school, and I went to St. Martin de Porres High School in Detroit. It was the first Black Catholic high school in the city, and it actually opened after the riots in Detroit, and unfortunately it closed in 2005. But with that said, we have all class reunions every year.
Do you really?
Nice.
Oh, that's so
anytime
beautiful.
we have our all class reunions, it's amazing to hear the extraordinary histories of people and
Right.
people who went to DeForest High School. We have some very successful, prominent professionals covering all areas. So when we come together, either virtually or in person, it's always a humbling experience to hear how at first the community was pushing back on the school, to hear where everybody's lives have went as a result of being educated at that high school. So.
And kind of how the school has transcended the walls and the
Oh,
doors
yeah,
that have closed.
absolutely.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but,
that's
you know, so
beautiful.
we're still an alive bunch of people, and over the years, some of our former teachers through the years come
Oh,
through,
that's nice.
which is amazing too. So.
I just wanted to, I love teaching what you said, Leslie, because I'm also thinking the same. I went to Catholic high schools, or at Catholic high schools, in Maine. And so racial diversity was not there, but curriculum was really, really diverse.
Wow.
And like
Nice.
reading Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler, like even things
Wow.
like that, like I had a really unique experience,
Yeah.
and tying in Catholic social teaching at that stage, I think is what put me on that path for like understanding how poignant those critical experiences can be in developing a pathway. And so I really do appreciate, when teachers are able to feel empowered in taking, like believing that students can handle that capacity of engaging with the material. And so I've also gone into working with like 6 through 12 grade students as well, teaching social justice. And so seeing those changes in curriculum and that kind of depth that is like, I feel like is a movement, like you're like changing and really adapting to what students need to be learning. It feels really right and feels really great. So thank you. This is lighting a fire in me. That's really exciting.
Thank you. Thanks for the work all of you all do on behalf of education too and the community.
So in the spirit of, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah,
cut you
no,
off. I was gonna say, in the spirit of giving away books, so I mentioned that this book was the winner of the Alexandria Award through the Center for Literacy Education. It's a project that Jodine and I have been working on. So the center purchased 500 copies of this and has been sending them across to schools across the United States. Our stack is getting a little low, but I grabbed 4 of them. And I think if I did it right, I put stars on a couple of the poems. So if you got a poem with a star on it, you can go home. Look at it. You can go home with a copy of the book. So, all right.
Yeah, you'll cry when you read that one, so just be prepared. Well, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Yes, yes, thank you.